Hello friends, Kerry Holton here with Connect 3 Ministries. In this video I want to give you a very brief introduction to the Old Testament book of Exodus. I say brief because I only want to try to answer a couple of questions. What is this book all about? And why should we read and study Exodus? Let me begin by offering an overview of the book. As you probably already know, Exodus is the second book of the Old Testament, the second book of the Bible, and the second book of the Pentateuch. Now, the Pentateuch is the name that we have given to the first 5 books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And you may know that these books are books of law. I began my refresher course in Exodus by going to Rubel Shelly's book, a book-by-book study of the Old Testament. I say a refresher course because I don't spend a lot of time in the book of Exodus. I'm more of a New Testament person, if you know what I mean. But I went to that particular book to kind of get a refresher of what that book was all about. And there, Shelly writes that the primary theme of the book of Exodus is redemption. Hey, wouldn't it be helpful if we could come up with one word that summarized every book of the Bible? Why don't you work on that? Anyway, Exodus is about redemption, about how God delivered or redeemed His people from bondage in Egypt. And of course, when we Christians read about that, I'm sure we'll be thinking of how Jesus has redeemed or delivered us from our bondage to sin. Well, Shelly goes on to list 3 major themes in the book. The first one is Passover. The second one is the law, or God's covenant with Israel. And the third theme is the tabernacle. After I went to Shelly's book, I went to Walter Kaiser's commentary on Exodus, where he writes that there are 6 major themes in the Pentateuch as a whole. So I want to bring those to bear and to mind. Number 1, God's blessing on all nature and humanity. That would be the book of Genesis, wouldn't it? Number 2, God's promise to the patriarchs. Again, Genesis. Number 3, God's deliverance in the Exodus from Egypt. Number 4, God's revelation of Himself in covenant, law, and tabernacling presence at Sinai. Number 5, the wandering in the wilderness. And the last theme of the Pentateuch is preparation for entrance into Canaan. Now, this might be helpful for us to know as we begin this study, because 3 of these themes, themes 3, 4, and 5, are treated in the book of Exodus. We have God's deliverance of His people from Egypt. We have the giving of the covenant, the law, and instructions for the building of the tabernacle. And we have the beginning of Israel's wandering in the desert. If we were to think of an outline to the book as another way for us to get a handle on the content of Exodus, we could divide the book into 2 major parts. First, Israel's departure from Egypt, chapters 1 through 15. And then their journey to and arrival at Mount Sinai, chapters 16 through 40. But let's break it down just a tad more. In this book, Moses chronicles the departure from Egypt, chapters 1 through 15, the giving of the law at Mount Sinai, chapters 16 through 24, and the tabernacle, chapters 25 through 40. And by the way, just here, I'll warn you in advance, you probably already know this, but I'll warn you in advance that those chapters, 25 through 40, are some of the driest in the Bible, in my opinion. We'll likely be stretched a bit to apply those texts to our daily lives, but we will. And this makes me think that you may be wondering, why are we even reading and studying this book? And to answer that question, let's begin by acknowledging that the Old Testament and the book of Exodus are books of history. They tell us about ancient history, about God's involvement in history. Now, I like history. I hope you do too. I enjoy reading history. Who doesn't, right? But I want to add just here that the Old Testament and the book of Exodus in particular are much more than chronicles of what happened in the past. In fact, if we're just reading these books to find out what happened in the past, well, we're not reading them to the greatest of benefits. Exodus is theological history. Theological history. That is, it was written to teach lessons. And this reminds me of a passage in the New Testament, Romans chapter 15, verse 4. Whatever was written in former days was written for our instruction, so that by steadfastness and by the encouragement of the Scriptures we might have hope. Perhaps we could say that the primary lesson of Exodus, and indeed of all of Scripture, is what God is like, and what it means for His people to live with that knowledge. Without a doubt, Exodus was written to teach God's people about Himself and about their relationship to Him. The story of Exodus, then, is designed to tell us what God is like, how He thinks of His people, the lengths to which He will go to deliver them, and the proper response of God's people to this great deed. And yes, our response to what God has done is important, because that's application. We do not want to read Exodus merely as students of history who are interested in ancient Israel and how God was active in that nation's history. We are not just interested in becoming smarter about God's story. No, we want to read Exodus with a view toward application. How might we apply our daily readings in this book to our own lives? Again, I thank you for your interest in participating in this study with us. And if you have any questions or comments, please post them on the Facebook group page or shoot me an email. I'll be glad to hear from you. God bless.